Hercule Poirot and the Wound That Did Not Bleach. Chapter 1. The Lady and the Card. The late September wind swept through the perfectly trimmed hedges of the Les Tillouls estate with unusual urgency, as if carrying secrets dragged from the valley floor, in the heart of the French countryside, surrounded by vineyards beginning to wither in shades of gold and russet. The mansion stood proud but silent. There, in a reading room permeated with lavender and ancient dust, the body of Clarice de Belleforte was found, her face at peace, her eyes closed as if asleep, and a small wound just above her heart. Without a drop of blood, Madame de Belleforte had been a widow for over 20 years and, by all accounts, held an almost royal position among the region's notables. Her annual festivities were celebrated, and her control over the town's minor social tragedies was as firm as it was discreet. So when her maid, Cecil, screamed that morning upon finding her lifeless on the blue velvet couch, the shock reverberated throughout the region. The most disconcerting thing was the wound. Barely visible, with no bleeding, it seemed more like a symbol than an act of violence. Dr. Marchand, immediately summoned, inspected the body and stammered that the cause of death was cardiac uncertainty. But he said it in a tone that betrayed his own doubt. "And this wound," he murmured, "doesn't seem ... natural." Inspector Duval, a man with a drooping mustache and limited patience, was the first to suggest something more sinister. It may have been poison, or a very fine instrument, but there's no trace of a struggle, no disorder, nothing was stolen, only this. He held up a carefully folded sheet of paper found in the deceased's hand. A letter with no addressee, written in ink that had dried. A single line: "No one will forgive me, least of all myself." The words, although laden with drama, did not convince the inspector of a suicide, nor did they convince the deceased's niece, Judith de Belleforte, who had arrived just 2 days earlier from Paris after a 3-year silence. Judith, elegant and restrained, listened to the doctor's explanation with tense lips, then asked to see the letter and read it without flinching. "It's not your handwriting," he said simply, leaving the room. Soon others were summoned to Les Tillouls. There was Colonel Armand de la Fère, Clarice's former suitor and after-dinner companion. Marianne Fouch, the young governess of Judith's daughter, recently arrived from Lyon. The surly, few-worded gardener Martin, who had served the family for decades, and the enigmatic Monsieur René Valmont, an art collector and, rumoured to be, the lady's last confidant. The atmosphere inside the house was dense. Quiet conversations floated through the hallways. Long glances passed over dinner, served that evening in silence. No one cried, but everyone seemed to fear that something else lurked beneath the polished surface of tragedy. Inspector Duval, perhaps out of intuition or perhaps out of desperation, made a call. The next day, with a brisk stride and a perfectly ironed jacket, the famous Belgian detective arrived at Les Tillouls. "Messieurs, Madame," he said with a slight nod, "I am Hercule Poirot. I have come not to look at the walls or measure the traces of crime, but to observe the faces, to listen to the pauses and the silences, because, as you know, human emotions rarely lie." And with that statement, the air itself seemed too tense. Poirot stopped in front of the couch, where the body still lay, covered by a white sheet. He looked around, the books lined up too symmetrically, the vase of still fresh lilacs, an unfinished china cup. Then he leaned toward the small desk at the side. There, carefully sealed, lay a glass inkstand. "The ink?" asked Poirot, pointing at it without touching it. No recent use, Duval said. The letter found wasn't written in this ink, apparently. Poirot raised an eyebrow. So, we found a fountain pen in Judith's purse. She says it's hers, but she's not sure when she last used it. Poirot nodded slowly, as if a piece, very small one, had just slipped into place. An anonymous letter, a wound that doesn't bleed, and a woman who doesn't write her own ending. M. or Mora. No. Moan. Amy. There's no room for the obvious here. He turned to those in the room, his eyes shining with genuine interest. Miss, I need to speak with each of you, one by one, not to accuse, but to understand. Because behind every crime isn't blood, but thought. And that, believe me, always leaves a trace. Thus, with his walking stick in one hand and his little grey cells in full swing, Hercule Poirot prepared to delve into the mystery of the wound that didn't bleed, and in lestoluels.com was only the prelude to disorder. Chapter 2, The Faces. Behind the veil, the second day at Lestoluels began with a persistent mist clinging to the vineyards like an unspoken secret. Hercule Poirot, after a meticulously structured night's rest, a cup of lime tea, 4 trips around the corridor, and the symmetrical placement of his shoes under the bed appeared at 8 o'clock in the main hall, where the members of the household were beginning to congregate. Breakfast was an exercise in awkward silences. Spoons clinked against cups with excessive precision, and exchanged glances seemed to rehearse phrases never spoken. Poirot, impeccable in his pearl-grey suit, sipped his coffee with methodical movements, observing everyone with apparent indifference, except for the slight arch of his eyebrows whenever someone avoided meeting someone's gaze. Judith de Belleforte was the first to be called into the small music room, converted by Poirot into an interview room. She appeared in an unadorned dark blue dress, her hair tied back tightly, and her expression almost defiantly composed. Mademoiselle Poirot began gently, sitting opposite her. Losing an aunt like Madame de Belleforte must be a painful blow, especially after a recent reunion. May I ask what brought you back after so many years? Judith raised her chin. A telegram, he said, from Clarice. She asked me to come. She said there was something important to discuss, something to do with my daughter, your daughter, Madeleine. She's 8 years old. She's at home, under the care of the governess. Poirot nodded slightly. And did you manage to talk to your aunt about that matter? No, I arrived Tuesday afternoon. She said she'd prefer to wait until Thursday, after dinner. She wanted to do it calmly and clearly, as she put it. And what happened that night? Judith looked down. After dinner, she retired early, I thought. It was strange. Clarice never went to sleep before 10. I went to see her at 11, but the door was already closed. I didn't insist. Poirot studied her face. There was a trace of fatigue on it, or perhaps restraint. And do you recognize this letter? Poirot handed her the sheet of paper he had found in the deceased's hand. Judith took it cautiously. It's not your handwriting, as I already told Inspector Duval. It's not mine either. But that paper, ... it's from your desk. I can tell from the watermark. You used that paper only for personal letters, and the fountain pen found in your bag. Judith seemed startled, though her voice remained firm. Yes, it's mine, but I haven't used it since I arrived. I prefer to write by hand in pencil. Poirot watched her for a long moment. And could someone else have had access to your bag? Everyone. Here, if you wish. No one was watching our belongings. Poirot bowed goodbye, jotting something down in his notebook before calling the next person. Asterisk, asterisk. Colonel Armand de la Fère entered with a mixture of dignity and annoyance. His boots were polished, and his moustache seemed an extension of his ego, neat, stiff, and carefully maintained. "Monsieur Poirot," she said in a courteous but distant tone, "I don't understand why you're questioning me. Clarisse has been in a delicate state for years. Her heart, as the doctor said, ... Oui, Monsieur le Colonel. However, you were a frequent visitor. Could you tell me what kind of relationship you had with Madame de Belleforte in recent months?" The Colonel raised his eyes to the ceiling as if searching for patience in the moulding, friendship, respect. There was an intellectual affinity between us. We played chess twice a week. And has anything changed lately? The Colonel hesitated for only a second. I noticed she was more nervous, as if she were waiting for bad news. Poirot tilted his head. "Were you afraid of something?" I couldn't say. He talked a lot about the inheritance, the paperwork, leaving everything in order. I found that odd, because he'd already left his will sealed years ago, and did you ever hear her mention a letter or a regret? The Colonel frowned. No, Clarisse was many things, but she wasn't someone who easily regretted it. Poirot let him go. And in his notebook he added a word : control ... asterisk. Next came Marianne Fouch, the governess, a young woman with an oval face, lucid gaze, and a measured voice. She held a children's reading book against her chest like a shield. "Miss Fouch, what was your relationship with Madame de Belleforte?" "Cordial. He hired me remotely, following a letter of recommendation from the Giroux family in Lyon." "And when did you get home?" "The same day as Judith. A little earlier, actually, around noon." "Did you notice anything unusual?" Marianne hesitated. Madame Clarisse seemed restrained, as if she were trying hard not to show any concern in front of the child. "But at night I heard footsteps in the hallway, as if someone were pacing nervously in front of her door." Poirot raised his eyebrows. "And did you see who they belonged to?" "No, but I heard creaks and a door opened softly. I didn't go out to look. It wasn't my place." Poirot appreciated her sincerity. Too observant for a governess, he thought. But he also noted an intrusive by nature. Something useful. Asterisk. Finally, it was Mr. René Valmont's turn. Tall, with a greyish beard and ivory cane, he looked more like a retired actor than an art collector. His Parisian accent was unmistakable. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, an honor. I never thought I'd meet the great detective under these circumstances. Of course, Monsieur Valmont," replied Poirot with a slight bow. "You visited Madame frequently, did you not?" "Yes, we exchanged opinions about prints, old correspondence. Clarisse had a fascinating library, although, I must confess, she'd been strangely evasive. These past few days, how evasive. He avoided talking about his niece. And once, he said this in an almost theatrical tone, I found an open envelope on his desk. It was empty, but it smelled strongly of bitter almonds." Poirot stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes narrowed. "You sure? Absolutely. I have a bloodhound's nose for poisons. I've written essays on the symbolic properties of cyanide in classical art." Poirot dismissed him politely, but this time he didn't write anything in his notebook. He simply closed the cover and stared out the window. The fog was beginning to dissipate, and with it, thought Poirot, the shapes beneath the surface were also beginning to become visible. Chapter 3. The Unexplained Wound. The hall clock struck 6 o'clock when Hercule Poirot returned to the music room, where Inspector Duval was leafing through his notes in visible frustration. The day had advanced with deliberate slowness, each interview adding more weight to the charged atmosphere of Les Toulouse. Outside, the sun was beginning to set behind the vineyards, dyeing the walls a pale ochre that seemed to blend with the dark wood of the furniture. "I don't understand, Monsieur Poirot," Duval said, without looking up. "All these testimonies, contradictory, incomplete, vague, but none of them point directly to murder." Poirot settled himself neatly into an armchair, crossing his legs and carefully adjusting his shirt cuffs. "Exactly, mon ami. And that's precisely what worries me." Duval frowned as, when a crime is truly hidden, it's not hidden with lies. It's hidden with partial truths, carefully distributed. Everyone here has told us something true, but no one has told everything. The inspector sighed, leaving the notes on the table, and the wound. "That damned wound, Dr. Marshing, insists there's no internal or external bleeding. What kind of attack leaves a mark on the heart without breaking the skin or causing bleeding?" Poirot leaned forward, "One that doesn't seek to kill with violence, but with meaning. Meaning, oui. The symbolic, the staged. This wound, it's not simply an attempt to hide a crime. It's a statement." Duval stared at him for a moment. Then he shook his head skeptically. "And the letter, was it staged too?" Poirot raised a finger. "I don't know that yet. But Miss Judith claims it's not her aunt's handwriting, and the paper, though personal, bears no fingerprints beyond the deceased's, and a faint ink stain in the top corner, and the pen in Judith's purse. It could have been placed there, or stolen, or even borrowed without malicious intent. But what interests me most is who knew that feather existed." Duval remained silent. Poirot stood up and went to the window. He looked out at the gardens, now empty, where the shadows were beginning to lengthen. "I'll tell you what worries me more than the wound, the letter, or the pen," he said, without turning around. "It's the girl that worries me. Madeleine, yes, 8 years old. Present in the house, but curiously invisible in every testimony. No one mentions her beyond a line. A small, intelligent, sensitive girl, and seemingly ignored by everyone." Duval looked at him strangely. "Do you think you saw something?" Poirot turned slowly. "I don't just think he saw something, Inspector. I think he understood something." Later that evening, Poirot asked to see the girl. Marianne Fouch escorted her to the greenhouse, where the detective waited surrounded by ferns and bougainvillea. The atmosphere was warm, the lighting dim, and the conversation blossomed like a shy flower. "Mademoiselle Madeleine," Poirot said with a smile, "I've heard you like books. Is that true?" She nodded, clutching an illustrated copy of The Secret Garden. "And do you also like to observe things?" Another nod. "Do you sometimes hear things that adults don't believe you've heard?" The girl looked at the governess, who stood some distance away, and then at the detective. Her eyes filled with a seriousness unbecoming of her age. "I saw my grandmother cry," he finally said. Poirot bowed slightly. "When, the night before he died, he was in the library, holding a letter. He didn't see me. Did you read the letter?" Madeleine shook her head. "But I saw you tear up another letter before. You threw it into the fire." "Another letter. I had a blue envelope." "I never used blue envelopes." "The blue envelopes belonged to the statue man. The man of the statues. That's what I call him. The one who came with the art books. The one who spoke slowly and smelled of strange tobacco. Poirot contained his surprise. The description left no doubt. René Valmont. Have you seen him in the library before? Once again, but I don't know when. I was asleep, and her voice woke me up. He was saying something like, "You can't hide it anymore," and she yelled, "Don't talk to me like I don't know what I did." Poirot took a deep breath. A child's words couldn't be proof, but they were a beacon in the darkness. "Thank you, mademoiselle," he said gently. "You've been very brave." He offered her a small porcelain figurina cat he'd seen on a shelf in the greenhouse. Madeleine took it as if it were a shared secret. As he left, Poirot turned to Marianne Fouch. "Miss, please take good care of this child. She's more lucid than all of us." "I know," the governess replied, "but not everyone knows how to listen." To her. Back in his room, Poirot arranged all the elements of the case on the table. The letter with the unsigned sentence, the photograph of the wound, a copy of Clarissa's will obtained that same afternoon from the notary, and the doctor's report. A blue envelope, he thought, a burnt letter, a symbolic wound, a confession spoken in a whisper, and a family locked in courtesies to avoid facing an ancient truth. Poirot ran his fingers through his moustache, smoothed it down precisely, and then murmured in a low voice, "The question, my dear, is not who killed Clarice de Belleforte." He held the letter up between his fingers, looking at it against the light. "The question is, what was it that forced her to die, before anyone could touch her?" Chapter 4. Echoes of an Unspoken Secret. The following morning brought with it a deceptive calm. A cool breeze swept through the vineyards of Les Tilleuls, but inside the house the air was thick. The servants moved with measured steps, as if afraid of making the floors creak too much, and the antique clocks struck the hour with a more solemn echo than usual. In the library, where Clarice de Belleforte used to spend her afternoons surrounded by leather-bound volumes, Poirot meticulously examined the deceased's desk. "Everything is in order," said Inspector Duval, watching him from the doorway. "The housekeeper claims that nothing has been touched since the day of the death." Poirot nodded without looking at him. "And doesn't that seem to you, Inspector, a little ... suspicious?" "The order, yes. Immaculate order. Excessive, as if they wanted to leave the scene. Not natural, but perfect." Duval entered the room, observing the objects with renewed attention. "And what exactly are you looking for?" Poirot removed a poetry collection from the shelf and leafed through it leisurely. Then he placed his hand on the second drawer of the desk and opened it slowly. Inside, neatly lined up, were envelopes, spare pens, and a small wooden box. "This," said Poirot, lifting the box, "wasn't here yesterday." "How do you know?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Because I opened this drawer last night. Empty, no box. And if someone put it in this morning, either they didn't expect me to see it, or they wanted me to see it." He gently opened the lid. Inside was an antique locket, a lock of hair tied with a blue ribbon, and a piece of paper folded in four. Duval stepped forward. Poirot unfolded the paper. It wasn't a complete letter, but a torn corner of something larger. But what was written was enough. It wasn't yours to keep. It wasn't yours to love. What you hid has eyes. Duval frowned. "Is it poetry?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, it's a reproach, coded but real. A message directed at someone who took something that didn't belong to them, or to someone." The entrance hall was bathed in light when Poirot asked to see the gardener. Martin, a man with a broad back and weathered hands, entered with a look of barely contained impatience. His boots bore traces of dirt, and his shirt showed the marks of work in the sun. "Mr. Poirot," he said, not bothering to feign politeness, "I don't know what I can do for you. I just water the plants and trim the hedges." "Ah, but sir, the gardener is the only one who sees what others don't. The shortcuts, the open windows, the comings and goings that don't pass through the front door." Martin crossed his arms. "I saw Mr. Valmont leave through the back door Wednesday night. Late, very late." "What time, exactly?" "Around 1 o'clock. It's not the first time he's done this. He always says he can't sleep and goes for walks, but he never comes back the same way." "Did you see him come in?" Martin shook his head. "Not that time." "And did you see anything else that night?" Martin hesitated for a moment. Then he lowered his voice. "I heard a scream, very faint, from the music room. It sounded like a woman's voice. But when I went to look out the window, everything was dark." Poirot inclined his head. "Thank you, sir. You've said a lot more than you realize." The next conversation was with the housekeeper, Madame Lemoyne, a wiry woman with a firm voice and a sense of duty etched in every fold of her apron. "Mr. Poirot," she said, offering him a tea tray, "Mrs. Clarice kept this house like a temple. Nothing moved without her knowledge. Even the books had an established order." Poirot accepted the tea, but did not drink it. "And did that order ever change?" "A few weeks ago, he pulled out several old genealogy books. He asked me to dust off the ones in the lower section of the east cabinet." He pointed to a closed cabinet, "which is odd, because he hadn't touched them in years." "Did he say what he wanted them for?" "Just that he needed to confirm something. And then he asked me for a box that was stored in the attic, one that had family portraits in it." Poirot frowned, and the box returned her to her room. "I don't know if she ever opened it. The day before she died, I saw her holding one of the photographs. She was crying. *** later." Poirot requested access to the will. He read it carefully for almost half an hour in the empty living room. His expression didn't change, except for a slight flicker when he reached the name of the soul. Heir, Judith de Bellaforte. The signature was recent. The notary had confirmed it, dated just 3 weeks earlier. Poirot closed the document thoughtfully. A saved portrait, a modified will, a burned letter, a blue envelope. The murder, if it could be called that, was not of the body, but of identity. That evening Poirot did not dine with the others. He remained in the library until late, meditating in front of the fire. When Duval went to look for him, he found him silent, staring at the carved figure of a swan on the mantelpiece. "Tomorrow," said Poirot without looking away, "I want to gather everyone here at 10 o'clock sharp." So that Poirot turned his eyes flashing with a mixture of severity and compassion, to ask a question, not about the crime, Inspector, but about the truth that preceded it. Chapter 5. The question nobody wanted to hear. At 10 o'clock sharp. As announced, Hercule Poirot appeared in the library with his unwavering punctuality and his brisk, almost musical gait. He was wearing a light grey suit, a blue silk tie, and his trademark white handkerchief folded with such precise symmetry that it seemed more a statement of philosophy than of style. Behind him, Inspector Duval stood with his arms crossed, his expression firm though undisguised, a certain intrigue. Everyone was waiting for him in the room. Judith, sitting upright by the window. Colonel Armand, standing by the globe as if searching for a country to flee. René Valmont, his cane between his legs, his expression indecipherable. Marianne Fouche, sitting with her back straight and her face neutral, and Martin, standing by the fireplace, like a poorly carved stone statue. Madame Lemoyne waited silently at the back, and little Madeleine, by Poirot's decision, was not present. "My friends," Poirot began, with a slight bow, "I have not yet come to point out the guilty parties. Don't be impatient. In a well-woven crime, impatience is the thread that unravels it." Everyone watched him in silence. "What I want," he continued, "is to ask you just one question. One that may not seem relevant at first, but I assure you it is." I walked slowly toward Clarice's desk, where she had placed the locket she found the night before. Mrs. Bellaforte died from a chest wound that didn't bleed. A wound that didn't match any conventional weapon, nor did it match a typical poison. And yet, that mark was the last thing left on her body. A mark, like a signature. He turned to them slowly. "What broke your heart?" There was a silence that wasn't simply the absence of sound, but a collective hesitation, as if no one knew if they had heard correctly, or if that question so direct, so intimate could even be answered out loud. "A scare," Marianne ventured, her voice tense. "News of a betrayal," Armand said, without looking at anyone. "Regret," Judith whispered, almost to herself. Poirot raised his hand. "Everyone seems to suggest emotional causes, but my interest is more specific. What concrete event, revealed or hinted at, occurred in the last few days that was powerful enough to destroy a woman accustomed to control, restraint, and strategy?" His eyes were fixed on René Valmont. "You brought old books, Monsieur Prince. Letters. Did you also bring any original family letters?" Valmont blinked. "Yes, some. Correspondence from the 19th century. Madame Bellaforte wanted to trace a direct line to a distant relative, a certain Apolline de Terre. She said there were gaps in the family tree. And did you discover anything?" The collector hesitated. Then he lowered his gaze. "Yes, an omission. Apolline had an illegitimate daughter, never officially recognized. But there is a letter from the local priest, tucked away in a book, that mentions a silent birth in Les Tilliols." The silence thickened. "And you showed that letter to Clarice?" "Yes, the night before he died." Poirot nodded gravely. "And what did he answer?" Valmont hesitated. "He didn't say anything. He closed the book. He asked me to leave." Poirot walked to the mantelpiece and stopped in front of the portrait of a young man in an antique uniform. He looked at it for a moment. "Do you know what's the most deadly thing for a woman like Clarice?" he asked, without turning round. "Not the betrayal of others, but the revelation of having built her life and the lives of those around her on a lie carefully selected and defended for decades." He turned to Judith. "Mademoiselle, did your aunt ever tell you about her birth?" Judith stood still. "She only told me that my parents died in an accident, that she raised me. I never knew any other story." "And your mother, did she ever mention your name?" Judith shook her head. Poirot paused for a measured moment. "Gentlemen, we are not just dealing with a crime here, but with a broken genealogy. A woman discovered, too late, that her authority was not sustained by blood, but by omission. And that revelation can kill more effectively than poison." Duval frowned. "Are you implying that Judith wasn't your niece?" "Insinuating, no. Suggesting, perhaps. But not yet affirming. Because for that, There's one more piece missing, one that Clarice tried to destroy, but not completely. He took a piece of paper out of his pocket, the same one he had found in the box with the locket. This letter, it wasn't written by Madame Clarice. It was sent to her, from Paris. An anonymous letter. Someone reminded her that what she hid, has eyes. Judith paled. And who wrote that? Poirot watched her for a long moment. That's the right question, but not the one to answer now. He turned to everyone. Tomorrow, my friends, tomorrow I'll ask you to sit here once more, and that's when every piece will fall into place. Because I assure you, this wasn't a crime committed by one hand. It was a shared decision, a shared secret, and without further ado, Poirot turned around and left the room. Behind him, silence remained like another guest. Chapter 6. The witness, who didn't speak night, fell on Les Tilloux with a restrained silence, as if the entire camp knew something was about to break. The oil lamps lit along the corridors cast overly long shadows, and the echo of footsteps in the upper gallery seemed to bounce deliberately. No one slept soundly that night. Closed doors hid insomnia, the creaking of a poorly nailed floorboard, a pendulum clock ticking with implacable punctuality. In the East Wing room, Poirot lay awake, sitting next to his suitcase, his fingers interlaced, his gaze fixed on a small embroidered handkerchief lying on the table. He didn't take notes, he didn't talk to himself. He just thought, because at this point in the investigation, it wasn't logic that was missing. It was the perfect moment to use it. At 7 in the morning, before the others had left, Poirot went in search of Madeleine. He found her in the greenhouse, kneeling on a cushion, watering a dwarf plant with a small cup of tea. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, without frightening her, "may I sit down?" She nodded without looking at him. Poirot settled himself gently, and for several minutes they remained silent. The detective watched her movements, how she held the cup carefully, how she smoothed the earth with her fingers after pouring the water. "Do you like taking care of things that grow?" he finally asked. "Yes. Plants don't scream, but if you listen to them, they tell you if they're thirsty." Poirot inclined his head affectionately. "People do that too. They talk silently." The girl finally looked at him with a serious expression. "Are you going to punish someone?" "No, dear. It's not my role to punish, just to understand." A moment passed before Madeleine spoke. "Sometimes Mum cries at night when she thinks I can't hear her, and do you know why? I think he misses his dad, but he's never told me about him." Poirot nodded slowly. "And your grandmother? Did she treat you affectionately?" "Yes, but I was also afraid of her. She always told me to keep quiet, not to ask questions, and he did it. No, I asked a lot of questions, but they didn't answer me. And did anyone do it?" The girl nodded gently. "Miss Marianne. She listens to me." Later, in the dining room, Marianne Fouch served breakfast with a slight trembling in her hands. When the rest of the guests entered, Judith, Armand, Valmont, and Martinique took their place at the table with slow movements, as if the very act of sitting down implied surrendering to something approaching. No one ate with appetite. Judith played with the rim of her cup. Valmont flipped through a newspaper without reading it. Martin stared out the window, chewing without swallowing. Poirot waited for silence. Then he stood up and walked to the glass cabinet, where he had discreetly placed the fragmented letter, the locket, and the old photograph that Madame Lemoyne had secretly given him that very morning. In the image, a young woman with dark hair, identical to Judith, was holding a newborn baby in her arms. On the back, scrawled, with a trembling hand, was a name, Apollo. "Gentlemen," said Poirot, "yesterday I asked you a question without an answer. Today, however, I will not ask any questions. I will tell you a story, and when I finish, we will know who killed Clarice de Belleforte. Although perhaps, more precisely, we should say, who pushed her to her death." Everyone looked up at the same time. The air in the room seemed to crystallize. "Many years ago," Poirot began, "a young noblewoman named Apolline had a daughter out of wedlock. In those days, this was a scandal. The child was raised as a niece of another branch of the family. Her existence was carefully concealed until even she herself believed it. But she didn't forget it." Poirot held up the photograph. "That girl grew up. She had a daughter, and that daughter's name is Judith." Judith gasped. She opened her mouth but didn't say a word. Clarice de Belleforte raised Judith as her niece, not out of compassion, but out of shame. For years, she controlled the family history like someone who rules a palace, with precision, with discipline, and with fear. But a few weeks ago, a letter arrived. A veiled threat. Someone else knew the truth. Valmont looked down. Armand cleared his throat loudly. "And who wrote that letter?" the colonel said in a strained voice. Poirot did not answer directly. Clarice feared that her moral empire would crumble, that Madeleine, her biological granddaughter, would be seen as a bastard from a bastard line. She tried to destroy the evidence. She burned one letter, hid another, but it was too late. Her heart, trained to be cold, couldn't bear the weight of having built a life on a lie. Poirot walked towards Judith. "You didn't kill your aunt, mademoiselle, but your arrival was the spark that lit what was already ashes. Your daughter's face, so similar to Apolline's, was the mirror Clarice couldn't face." Judith covered her mouth with her hand. Tears fell, soundlessly, and someone who wanted to see Clarice fall, took it upon themselves to deliver the ultimate truth to her. Not with a knife, not with poison, with a blue envelope, with a letter, with a sentence written to destroy. Poirot took out a folded sheet of paper. "Madame Lemoyne gave me this. She found it behind the baseboard in the library. It's not signed, but it has the same ink, the same type of paper, and a telling detail. It smells of spiced tobacco." His eyes were fixed on René Valmont. "Is there anything you want to tell us, monsieur?" The collector swallowed. His hands gripped the cane. "I didn't mean to kill her. Just open her eyes. And why? Because she did it to me. She ruined me. She stole an inheritance that was my maternal inheritance. She fabricated documents. She rewrote legacies. She was ruthless." Poirot nodded sadly, so he chose to strike back. With his own weapon, the hidden truth. Valmont did not defend himself. Did that kill her? Not the paper, not the ink, but the knowledge. The mirror he couldn't bear. Poirot turned to Duval. "We've reached the heart of the matter, mon ami, and that heart didn't bleed, because it was already empty." Chapter 7. The second letter. After René Valmont's silent confession, the air in the library remained suspended. No one moved. Judith sat with her face covered by both hands, breathing heavily, while Armand de la Fère clenched his jaw as if its rigidity could halt the course of the inevitable. Marianne Fouche watched Madeleine, sitting outside the threshold, playing with a branch as if she hadn't quite grasped that the history of her blood had changed. Forever Poirot, without needing to raise his voice, retrieved the blue envelope Madame Lemoyne had found. With extreme delicacy, he placed it on the coffee table, next to the fragments of the torn letter and Appolline's photograph. "Here is the instrument," he said gravely. "A letter sent unsigned, but with a purpose. A dagger in the form of a written word." Valmont didn't protest. He sat expressionless, as if he'd already emptied himself of everything. "But there's still something," Poirot continued, walking slowly, "that doesn't quite fit. A second wound, let's say, less visible. Because if Clarisse died from the weight of knowledge, who helped her fall?" Those present turned their eyes towards him, confused. Clarisse de Belleforte was a woman who knew how to survive shame. She had hidden truths more than once, so why didn't she resist this last one? Poirot stopped by the grandfather clock. Because she wasn't alone. Because someone else, in this house, helped seal her downfall. With a second letter, a murmur ran through the room. Duval narrowed his eyes. "Another letter. Yes, that's logical. One hit her with the past, the other with the present." Poirot turned to Marianne Fouch. "Miss, were you present when Clarisse received Valmont's letter?" "No, sir. He wouldn't let me. But did you see her afterwards?" "Only from a distance." She looked devastated. Poirot nodded. "And you were the one who kept the genealogy books they used?" "Yes. I put them back on the shelf myself. And at that moment, did you see anything else? Anything out of place?" Marianne hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I saw an envelope, ivory-colored. It was on the piano. It wasn't from the lady. It didn't have her handwriting on it." Poirot bowed, his voice even lower, and he opened it. "No, but I saw it the next day, burned in the fireplace. Only the border remained, and the stamp. It wasn't from France." Duval stood up. "And where was he from?" "From London," Poirot answered for her. "I confirmed it this morning with the local postman. An envelope with a British postmark arrived the same day as the blue one from Valmont. 2 knocks, simultaneous." Judith finally spoke, her voice hoarse from the sustained silence. "And who sent that second letter?" Poirot looked directly at Colonel Armand de la Fère. "That is the question you, monsieur, should perhaps answer." The Colonel tensed. "Are you insinuating?" "I'm not implying. I'm stating this. You received a letter from London weeks ago. I saw it on your desk. It was written by your niece, Sybil, in it. She mentions that she's found documents about the Belleforte family lineage and that she wished to send them to Clarisse directly. Since you refused to do so," Armand jumped up, "that was my business. And you made it everyone's business by allowing Sybil to write to Clarisse without warning her of the contents. Or did you think she wouldn't? You knew the information was coming and you didn't stop it. Out of pride or out of revenge?" "Clarisse humiliated me," the Colonel said, his filter gone. "She made me feel like an intruder in this house for years. When Sybil sent me copies of the family tree, I thought maybe it was time to let the truth speak for itself." And he spoke, in 2 languages, from 2 different cities, on the same day. Poirot returned to his place by the locket. Mrs. Clarisse didn't die from a hand, nor from a single truth. She died from the accumulated weight of many truths, sent on paper, wrapped in ink and unresolved grudges. Duval approached Valmont. "Should I arrest him?" Poirot raised a hand. "Not by writing a letter, But I think Monsieur will understand if I invite him not to leave the village for a few days. There are still legal matters to be cleared up." Valmont nodded without a fight, as if he knew the story wouldn't end with a prison sentence, but with the living memory of what he had done. ***, when everyone had left, Poirot remained alone by the fire. He slowly lit a match and watched the flame flicker, faintly, as if hesitant to fully emerge. Madame Lemoyne entered discreetly, leaving a tea tray, and Miss Judith. "He needs time and answers, but he'll find them. And you, Monsieur Poirot, are you satisfied?" The Belgian detective stared at the fireplace. "The truth, madame, never satisfies anyone, but sometimes it leaves room for a fresh start." Chapter 8. What the portrait didn't say. The next morning arrived with an almost ceremonial stillness. A cloudless sky rose over the vineyards, which breathed a respite, as if the earth itself understood that something had been unleashed in Les Toulouse. But inside the house, the echo of the revelations continued to resonate. The glances were more measured, the steps more cautious. The tea was served hotter, but allowed to cool in the cups. Poirot did not come down to breakfast. Instead, he asked that no one interrupt him as he retired to Clarice de Bellefort's room. The door was opened by Madame Lemoyne, who offered him a solemn look before silently withdrawing. The air inside the bedroom was scented with dried lavender, and the bed remained untouched, as if death had not yet been admitted into that space. Poirot moved with precision. First he looked at the chest of drawers, then at the shelves of photographs, and finally at the large oval mirror opposite the wardrobe. He ran his fingers over the polished surface, paused in front of a small porcelain figurine dancer with broken arms and side. On the north wall, a portrait of Clarice in her youth dominated the room. She wore a pale lace dress, her expression enigmatic, and she held a fan between her fingers. At her feet, almost imperceptible, was a childlike figure. The young Apolline Poirot approached. He looked at the frame, then at the fabric. He carefully felt the edges, searching, and found it. A slight detachment at the bottom, a line of fabric. That had been rissoon. "Ah," he murmured approvingly. "We always keep what we're most afraid of losing when no one would look at it twice." He removed the portrait with the help of a pen. Behind it, a shallow hollow concealed a wooden box covered in grey velvet. It was unlocked. Inside was a letter, just one. The envelope was addressed to Judith in firm, measured handwriting. The postmark was recent. It didn't look like it was mailed, but rather prepared for personal delivery. Poirot did not open it. Instead, he stuffed it into his jacket and headed to the library, where Judith was waiting for him, her face haggard, a cup of cold coffee in her hands. "Do you want answers?" he asked, still not sitting down. "I fear them more than I desire them," she replied. "But yes, I love them." Poirot placed the letter on the table without pushing it towards her or touching it more than necessary. "Your aunt wrote this for you. She hid it, not out of cowardice, but out of the most complex of emotions, pride wrapped in remorse." Judith reached out her hand, her movements trembling, but she didn't open it immediately. "Why didn't you tell me before? Why did you keep quiet?" For so many years, Poirot finally sat down. "Because sometimes, madame, love isn't a flower that reveals itself, but a seed that buries itself too deeply." Clarice believed that protecting her meant denying her the past. But the past always demands its place. Judith looked down at the envelope. her fingers caressing the edges. "And you think she loved me?" Poirot answered without hesitation. "In its own way, yes. But Clarice's love was like her garden, severe, pruned, symmetrical. Anything that grew out of order was uprooted. And you, mademoiselle, grew by twisting the roots of the tree." A tear rolled down Judith's cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "And Madeleine, she represents what Clarice couldn't control. Innocence without structure. Blood without a last name." Judith opened the letter. Carefully, she read it silently for several minutes. Poirot didn't interrupt her. His eyes moved slowly over the lines. When she finished, she closed her eyelids, took a deep breath, and spoke barely above a whisper. She said that she knew all along, that she loved me anyway, that she feared me more than she cared to admit, that she protected me from herself. Poirot nodded. "And that, madame, doesn't absolve you, but it does explain you." Judith folded the letter. Her hands, though trembling, seemed to have regained some composure. "What will I do now?" Poirot stood up. "What the living do, madame. Move forward, without forgetting, but without repeating. Asterisk, asterisk." As Judith walked slowly away, Poirot headed into the garden. There, under the fig tree, Madeleine was playing alone with a coloured rope. Seeing him, he stopped, as if he knew something important was about to be said. "Madeleine," he said softly. She looked up. "Is everything fixed?" Poirot smiled slightly. "Not entirely, but some pieces fell into place, and that's enough to keep me breathing." The girl nodded. Then, without warning, she handed him the rope. "Do you want to play?" Poirot took one end. "Yes, but only if you teach me the rules." "They're easy," she replied. "You just have to hold on." And Poirot, for the first time in days, allowed himself a small, clean laugh, unburdened by deaths or secrets. Because sometimes, he thought, in the darkest mysteries, the true answers are not in the questions, but in who remains to remember them. Chapter 9. The Things That Were Never Said. The hours following the discovery of the letter were slow, almost suspended in the air. In Les Tillables, the visible turmoil of the previous day had given way to a kind of final calm, but it wasn't peace. It was containment. Judith shut herself in her room, Clarice's letter still in her hands, as if the vivid handwriting of the woman who raised her could erase, line by line, the wound of so many years of omission. Each sentence cut through her with a double edge, consolation and reproach, tenderness and distance. She didn't know whether to cry or give thanks. She didn't know whether to forgive or bury. Madeleine, oblivious to details but sensitive to the surroundings, remained glued to Marianne Fouch, who did her best to keep the child occupied with gentle stories and short walks in the garden, knowing that questions would soon come. And when they did, they would be answered not only with facts, but with compassion in the library. Poirot reviewed the documents rescued from the hiding place behind the portrait for the last time. He did so not out of doubt, but out of respect. That case, like some of the most painful he had ever faced, wasn't resolved in court or with handcuffs. It was resolved, if anything, in the memories of those who remained, in how things would be told afterward, and in what they would choose to keep quiet. Duval entered without knocking, but with a moderate gesture, like someone who knows that authority does not always require noise. "Are you leaving today, Poirot?" "This afternoon, yes. I have a 5 o'clock train, but not without leaving some pieces in place." The inspector nodded. He approached the desk where Valmont had been interrogated days earlier and sat down without asking permission. There was no crime, strictly speaking, he said, as if repeating himself. No one wielded a gun. No one poisoned the tea. But still, she died. Oui, mon ami. And that's the hardest thing to accept. That sometimes you can be killed by the truth, not by its existence, but by its sudden appearance. Why Valmont? Poirot watched him for a moment. He won't go far. He's lost too. He thinks he won, because he pushed Clarisse toward her fall. But he didn't calculate what that would bring back. A blank face in the mirror. A victory without purpose. Revenge is a tightrope. It spans the abyss, but leaves no floor at the end. Duval rubbed his forehead. Then he stood up. Why, Judith? She's grieving, but not for a death, for a life that wasn't what she thought it would be. Her story has changed radically. She needs time to figure out what to do with that new seed. The inspector hesitated. And have you decided to abandon Les Tailloux? Poirot tilted his head. Then you'll do what your mother never could. Walk by choice, not by command. Around noon, Judith asked to see Poirot privately. He received her in the conservatory, where the air was mild and the leaves rustled among themselves without the need for wind. Monsieur Poirot, she began, her voice faint. I've read the letter at least a dozen times, and I still don't know whether he asked my forgiveness, or permission. Poirot didn't reply immediately. He picked up a fallen twig and turned it between his fingers. Perhaps both. Clarisse didn't know how to love unconditionally, but she didn't know how to live with doubts either. You were both things to her, a wound and a testimony, and do. You think that he loved me? In her own way, yes. Not the way you needed, but the way she was capable of. Judith looked down. I've decided to stay. For now, Madeleine needs stability, and so do I. Les Tailloux doesn't have to be an inheritance. It can be a starting point. Poirot smiled, barely. That, madame, is the bravest decision of all. She stood up, and in doing so, she seemed taller. Not because of her posture, but because of acceptance. As if the truth, far from crushing her, had restored her dignity. Before leaving, she turned to him one last time. Do you think Clarisse knew she was going to die? Poirot looked at her tenderly. I think Clarisse finally knew she couldn't live the way she was anymore. And in her world, that was the same. At 4:30, the carriage was waiting for Poirot in front of the gate. His suitcase was ready, his walking stick polished, and his coat arranged with impeccable symmetry. Marianne, Fouch, and Madeleine came to say goodbye. The girl, seeing him, ran towards him with a flower in her hand. For you, he said. It has no thorns. Poirot accepted it with a ceremonious bow. Thank you, mademoiselle. Thornless flowers are rare and very wise. Will he come back? Maybe, but not as a detective. Maybe as a friend. And is everything okay now? Poirot crouched down to his level. Things don't get better overnight, but they begin to heal when someone tells the truth and someone else listens. And that has already happened here. The girl nodded solemnly. Marianne took Madeleine's hand and said goodbye with a shy smile. Poirot got into the carriage. As he drove along the road between the poplars, he looked out the window at the house he now knew not only for its mystery, but for its humanity, and in the back of his mind a phrase formed, soft as an echo. Some wounds don't bleed, but they also heal. Chapter 10. Clarisse's Notebook. The 5 o'clock train glided gently through the French countryside when Poirot closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to remember precisely. Beside him, in a small leather suitcase, lay an object he hadn't mentioned to anyone, not to Duval, not to Judith, not even to Madame Lemoyne, although he suspected the latter had seen it disappear into the false bottom of Clarissa's desk. A black-covered notebook, bound in worn leather, untitled, unadorned. The personal diary of Clarice de Belleforti. He had discovered it hours before leaving, hidden behind a false wall in the top drawer of his room's writing desk. It didn't have a lock. It didn't need one. Its contents, more than dangerous, were painfully intimate. Poirot waited until he was alone in his compartment before opening it. The handwriting was firm and orderly, as if each letter had been deliberately chosen to maintain an inner composure. The first pages spoke of ordinary days, Colonel Armand's visits, Marianne's arrival, concerns about heart health, the choice of tableware for Thursday's dinner. But as we moved forward, the entries changed tone. Judith will arrive tomorrow. She asked me for an appointment to talk privately. What does she know? Is she suspicious? Or is she simply here to close a chapter she doesn't fully understand? Poirot read with increasing attention. I saw Madeleine this evening. She has my eyes, but not my hands. She moves them like Apolline. Sometimes I think the blood finds its way without asking permission. Valmont insists on coming this week. He says he has documents. I think he does. I think he knows. But he won't say anything directly. He's always preferred the slow poison of insinuation. Still, I'm not afraid for myself. I'm afraid for Judith. I'm afraid for what the past will do to her self-image. I've rewritten my will, not because I feel I owe anything, but because I fear I'm no longer in a position to direct what comes next. Perhaps for the first time, Poirot paused on that sentence. Direct what comes. That woman hadn't lived, but orchestrated. Her house was a theatre, her silences were directives, and her affection, a silent condition. If she rewrote now, it was not only out of fear, but out of a strange form of surrender. Today I burned the letter, the blue one. But it wasn't enough. There's another one from London, signed by Sybil. It speaks of a bloodline that can't be erased. I feel trapped, as if all the architecture I built to protect Judith is now a weapon against her. I thought about talking to her, telling her the truth, but then I saw her face, so determined, so out of character. I couldn't stem the tide. Not this time, sometimes. I wish I hadn't outlived her mother. Poirot closed the diary at that point, not out of lack of interest, but out of respect. What remained was less about facts and more about the collapse of a conscience. The last entries were fragmentary. He repeated phrases he wrote and crossed out, as if his mind no longer knew whether it wanted to reveal itself or disappear. Asterisk, asterisk. When the train stopped in Lyon for a technical break, Poirot got off to stretch his legs. The afternoon had turned golden. The platforms smelled of coal and cheap perfume. A young porter offered to help him with his suitcase, but Poirot politely declined. In his inside pocket, he put the diary. He wouldn't return it to Les Tillouls, not out of selfishness, but out of pity. Sometimes, testimonies from the heart don't need readers, only silent witnesses. Asterisk, asterisk. That night, already settled in his Paris apartment, Poirot wrote a brief letter to Judith de Belleforti, not to tell her what he had found. Not yet, but to leave a door open. Madame, Family truths, when revealed, don't change who we are. They only illuminate the shadows where we once feared to look. You are not the product of a secret, but proof that the truth doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it liberates. Don't destroy the past, but don't inherit it as a burden. Affectionately, H.P. He sealed it with his personal seal and sent it with his assistant the next morning. He didn't expect a reply. He didn't need one. 2 days later, he received an unexpected letter. It wasn't from Judith, Duval, or Marianne. It was from Madame Lemoyne, brief, terse, almost a whisper. Mr. Poirot, this morning, while I was going through the ladies' closets, I found a package with no return address. Inside was a small music box and a note. By the time she is able to understand, the box is now in Miss Judith's possession, and the tune. It was the same one Clarisse used to hum when she thought no one was listening. Poirot folded the letter. Slowly, he closed his eyes. Sometimes, he thought, the last words aren't spoken out loud. Not in letters, not in trials. Sometimes they are in a melody, one that only someone very small and very brave will be able to remember. Chapter 11. The music that belonged to nobody. A week after his return to Paris, Poirot sat in his study, facing the bay window overlooking Boulevard Haussmann. It was a clear morning, almost offensively quiet. The bells of the church of St. Augustine struck 10. Yet the detective had not yet opened his newspaper or arranged his hard-boiled eggs to the exact temperature. On his desk, surrounded by neat piles of unopened correspondence, lay the letter from Madame Lemoyne that had arrived a few days earlier. To one side, as if holding its own pause, was the small music box mentioned in it, not because he had it in his possession. The box had been left in Judith's hands, but because Poirot had known it before, not in form, but in essence. He had heard it, without knowing it, more than once. A subtle, almost imperceptible hum that Clarisse de Belleforti murmured on spring afternoons when she thought no one was listening. A musical thread without a name, without lyrics, and, perhaps, without an owner. And now they discovered it wasn't improvised, that it had a purpose, that it held something more. By the time she is able to understand, Poirot, a man of structure and symmetries, understood the architecture of silence better than anyone. That message wasn't a material legacy. It was a seed wrapped in music, a truth without text, an attempt at redemption that couldn't be named. He stood up slowly and walked to the closet where he kept some of his most peculiar objects. Among them, in a small box with a brass clasp, he kept a series of voice memos recorded on wax cylinders, obsolete, but still functional, system that he used in especially personal cases. He inserted one into the phonograph, turned the crank, and sat down as a woman's voice, high-pitched and clear, began to speak. It wasn't Clarisse. It was a woman named Odette, a cabaret singer, a key witness in a case of deadly jealousy in Marseille. But the gesture of reproducing that ancient... The voice was what he was after, a reminder that, in bloodless crimes, the clues were echoes. Echoes of actions, of absences, of unspoken words. The music box melody was one of those clues. Not as proof, but as a mirror. Asterisk, asterisk, that same afternoon, a letter arrived with green borders and slanted handwriting. It came from Les Titluls, not from Judith, from Madeleine. Mr. Poirot, Mum said I can write to her now. I want to tell her that the music box does remind me of my grandmother. The melody is like one I once dreamed of. Marianne says that songs are like memories that are passed on without speaking. Thank you for helping us. Sometimes Mum still cries, but she lets me see her cry. She didn't before. Do you also have hidden music? Your friend Madeleine Poirot stood still. Then he smiled without urgency. Yes, he thought. He too had melodies no one had heard, but they weren't meant to be played, just remembered. He kept Madeleine's letter with great care between the pages of a book he rarely opened, an old edition of Thoughts by Pascal, knowing that in the midst of reflections on the human heart and reason, the voice of a little girl would have the right refuge. Asterisk, asterisk, 2 days later, while having breakfast in the small cafe on his street, Poirot read a short newspaper column about the restoration of a rural estate in the south. Les Tillios would open its doors to the public in the spring to offer chamber music, concerts, and literary readings. A new era, the article said. A tribute to the memory of its owner. Poirot looked up from the page, as if hearing an echo on the other side of the street noise. He wasn't surprised. Judith had found a way to redefine, not to erase, but to reconstruct. Asterisk, asterisk, that night, Poirot had a strange dream. He was walking through a large garden, where every bush was shaped like a symbol, a key, an hourglass, a feather, a heart. In the center, a little girl was playing a music box on a marble pedestal, and from the box came not just a melody, but images, memories suspended like dust in the sun. The young Apolline, laughing with a crooked hat. Clarice, still a teenager, burning an unopened letter. Judith, as a child, reading secretly under a sheet. Valmont alone, staring at a tree with moist eyes. Poirot approached the pedestal, and as he reached out to touch the box, a voice said softly, "It's not for you, monsieur. You've heard enough." And then he woke up, not with shock, but with something like understanding. Asterisk, asterisk. The next morning, Poirot placed a single flower on his desk, a white lily. There was no point in explaining why. No one would ask. His assistant, upon seeing it, merely straightened it slightly and smiled without comment. The resolution of the Belleforti case wouldn't end up in newspapers or courtrooms. It wouldn't have headlines or fans, but in an old house, in a room where a music box plays again on rainy afternoons, a little girl has started asking questions, and a mother has started to answer, and that, for Hercule Poirot, was justice enough. Chapter 12. The Invisible Footprint. It was an unusually warm morning for late autumn in Paris. The golden leaves still hung from the trees on Boulevard Malesherbes, as if reluctant to fall, suspended between seasons, between what was and what is about to leave. Hercule Poirot, impeccably dressed in his light grey flannel jacket with a neatly folded handkerchief in his pocket, stood on the terrace of the Café Drouant, intently reading a small cloth-bound book. It wasn't a mystery novel or a treatise on logic, but rather an anthology of letters from mothers to daughters throughout history, from empresses and artists to anonymous women. The words, so different in time and tone, shared a common desire to be understood beyond time, context, and above all, silence. Poirot slowly closed the book and placed it carefully on the table. As he did so, a shadow stopped in front of him. Judith de Belleforti stood, dressed soberly but firmly. She was wearing a dark blue coat, a grey wool scarf, and a folder under her arm. Her eyes, though tired, now had a different light. They weren't seeking approval. They were seeking conversation. Poirot stood up instantly. "Madame, what an unexpected honor. Did Paris summon you?" Or did you decide to come looking for it? Judith smiled slightly. Both. I'm here for an art exhibition. And another one that hasn't even opened yet. Shall I serve you some coffee? Gladly. But first, he said, handing her the folder, I want you to see this. Poirot took the object carefully. He opened it. Inside was a sheet of lined paper, handwritten. It was a score, a simple, clean, melancholic melody. In the lower right corner, a title, The Wound That Did Not Bleed, and under the title, a dedication in firm letters. For Madeleine, so you know that even what is not said has music. Mother Poirot read it silently. Then he looked up, moved. Did you compose it? No, I transcribed it. It's the melody from the music box. But then, little by little, it began to grow. To complete phrases we never heard from Clarice, but which now, with distance, we can imagine. Marianne helped me with the harmonization. Madeleine, she chose the name. Poirot gently closed the folder. It's a very beautiful way of telling. A truth without repeating a wound. Judith sat, stirring the sugar in her cup even though she didn't add any. Her voice dropped barely above a whisper. Do you know what was the most difficult, Poirot? Tell your daughter. No, hoping she'd ask me the right questions. Not all of them. Just one. Why didn't you tell me before? And knowing I wouldn't. Have an answer that wouldn't make her doubt me. Poirot nodded slowly. That's the invisible wound. The one that leaves no external mark, but doesn't forget either. And you? She asked, changing her tone. How do you handle these cases when there are no obvious culprits? When the crime isn't what someone did, but what they couldn't prevent? Poirot leaned back slightly in his chair. More difficult, madame, because you can't apply logic to emotional holes. One can only walk carefully around them and hope that time will soften them. Judith took a sip of coffee, then took a second piece of paper out of her purse. It was a typewritten sheet of paper. I've decided to donate part of the estate. The West Wing will be a small conservatory for children, with music and reading workshops, in the name of Clarice and Apolline. Both will be remembered there, not for what they denied, but for what they left unnamed. Poirot bowed respectfully. It's an act of profound reparation, madame. A way of remembering without revenge. Exactly what I wanted. For Madeleine to grow up not to forget, but to understand. There was a moment of silence between them, not awkward, just filled. Poirot put his cup aside. Will you be returning to Les Tilleuls soon? In 3 days. But first, I'll go visit my mother's grave in Lyon, the real one. The one I never knew was hers until now. I want to tell her, even if it's just in a low voice. I know who you are now. Poirot smiled tenderly. And that, madame, will make you someone your mother can also know, even if it's just now. Judith nodded. She stood up slowly. As she said goodbye, she placed the folder with the score on the table. Keep a copy, not for the case, for the music. Thank you, madame. I'll keep it. Among the things you don't need to resolve, but do need to remember. She left without looking back. Asterisk, asterisk. That evening, Poirot took out his phonograph once more. Not to listen to an old cylinder, but to improvise with his fingers the melody of the wound that did not bleed in the keyboard of the upright piano he rarely used. The notes were simple. There were no virtuoso turns, but each chord seemed to carry the echo of what hadn't been said in time, and of what, even in its delay, still reached its destination. When he finished, he fell silent, not with pity, but with reverence. Because not all crimes leave corpses, but all acts, even the silent ones, leave traces. And he, Hercule Poirot, knew better than anyone how to follow them. Chapter 13. The Letter That Was Never Sent. When the drawing-room clock struck 9:15, Poirot was seated at the late Madame Dufour's desk, in front of a table lamp that cast a yellowish light over the mahogany surface. Around him, the room seemed frozen in time, the same vases of dried flowers, the same portraits of ancestors that didn't smile from the walls, and in one corner, the same side table where someone no doubt had left an abandoned teacup, barely touched. Madame Rougier, after a brief insistence, had allowed him to review her mother's personal correspondence, not without reservations. "My mother was very private, Monsieur Poirot," she had said, adjusting her lace handkerchief. "But if you think there might be some clue there, then ... Poirot had reassured her with a nod. "Don't worry, mademoiselle. I'm discreet by nature." And now there he was, examining with white gloves a blue velvet-lined box meticulously arranged by date. Incoming correspondence, birthday cards from a niece in Lyon, notes from the gardener, and, almost at the bottom, an unstamped envelope, carefully folded in 3, addressed with a shaky hand, for Judith. Never forget, no date, no signature, just that melancholy heading. Poirot opened the paper, unfolding it cautiously. Asterisk Judith. My dear, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. I wanted to protect you, as I wasn't protected. But the past has teeth, Judith, and it bleeds, even without visible wounds. Sometimes the truth is like a broken mirror. That's why I preferred to remain silent. But you deserve to know. Marianne isn't your enemy, nor is she who you think she is. What you saw in her, that duplicity, that restrained expression, isn't a lie, but a defense. The last name she bears isn't hers, nor mine. One day you'll know, when you find the D minor score, your mother, who always loved you, CD. Asterisk Poirot. Read the letter twice. Then, without saying a word, he stood up and walked to the closed piano in the opposite corner of the room. With extreme delicacy, he lifted the lid. The keys, yellowed with age, emitted a slight creak as if protesting against being awakened. In the lower compartment, the one known only to the most intimate pianists, Poirot slipped his hand. Nothing at first, just dust and an old embroidered handkerchief, but behind a small, detached wooden panel, he found something else, a handwritten sheet of music staves, titled in black ink, Fragment in D minor, for 2 voices, anonymous, a score, unfinished but accurate, with pencil notes, and in the lower right corner, the initials M.L. Poirot examined her with a raised eyebrow. Voila, he murmured. The soul that didn't want to be heard, nevertheless left behind a piece of music. The next morning, Judith waited on the main terrace, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, her face visibly shaken. The north wind carried with it the smell of damp earth and wood ash. Poirot approached him slowly. He said nothing at first. He just left the score and the letter on the table. Judith didn't touch them. She just stared at them for a long minute. "That's her handwriting," she murmured. "That way of closing the E's and stretching the E's. It's definitely her handwriting. Where did she find it?" Poirot replied softly, "In the room where the past hides, mademoiselle. The one we all think we know, but where there are still unanswered echoes." She nodded, as if a piece had fallen into place in her mind, but, instead of reading the letter, she picked up the sheet music and held it up to the light. This was written by Marianne, he said. I heard her play it once, very early on. I thought she was improvising. And why would she use her real initials here? Poirot tilted his head. What if they weren't her initials? What if someone else signed for her? Or what if that music was a coded confession? Judith blinked. What do you mean? I mean, Mademoiselle, your mother didn't just write a letter. She wrote an emotional code, and she hid it where no one would look, in the heart of her adopted daughter. Or perhaps not as adopted as you think. Judith's face paled. Are you suggesting that Marianne Poirot raised a hand? I don't suggest. I observe, I deduce, and I wait. Later that day, Poirot met with Inspector Beaufoy in the library office. The policeman, always somewhat skeptical of the Belgian detective's methods, skimmed the letter with a frown. So, according to you, this letter changes the motive for the crime. It doesn't change it, my friend. It reveals it. And what is that motive, exactly? Poirot smiled. I'm not in a position to say yet, but I can assure you of one thing. The wound that didn't bleed wasn't on the skin, but on the identity. And every crime born of silence leaves a trace, even if it's invisible. Beaufoy closed the letter, resigned. So what do we do now? Poirot approached the window. The garden was deserted, save for one figure, Marianne, sitting on the stone bench, staring into space. Double quotes now, my dear. We observe, because the guilty soul begins to break not when it is accused, but when the exact reflection of its truth is returned to it. And without turning around, he added in a low voice, the culprit already feels the music approaching. Chapter 14. The voice that took too long to sing. The evening breeze blew through the conservatory veranda, gently rustling the linen curtains and making the fern fronds in their hanging pots vibrate. Marianne was there, sitting on the edge of a folding chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face directed toward the steamed windows. She didn't turn when she heard Poirot's soft footsteps, but her posture stiffened, as if she already knew this. Meeting was inevitable. A cool day for warm thoughts, said Poirot gently, taking a seat next to her without invitation. Marianne didn't respond immediately. She watched the drops of condensation form and slide down the glass. My mother used to come here every morning, she murmured finally. She said plants listen better than people. Poirot nodded. Plants don't interrupt, mademoiselle. They don't judge, but they don't forget either. What grows near a truth tends to absorb it. Marianne turned her head slightly. Have you come to accuse me, Monsieur Poirot? No, I came to understand. That's what I do, you know. I don't look for culprits. I look for the balance that was broken. She sighed. Then you'll understand I didn't break anything. I just picked up the pieces. Poirot studied her profile carefully. The rigidity of her jaw, the measured pause between each word. There was an ancient sadness in her disciplinedly contained, like a note that refuses to burst into tears. Your score in D minor, he said finally. We found it, signed with your real initials. Marianne wasn't fazed. She just said, I wrote it years ago. I didn't think anyone would find it. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Then why sign it? Because in that music, I was myself, not Clarice, not Judith, not any of the masks, just Marianne. I don't care if they know, not anymore. Poirot was silent for a few seconds. Then, softly, did Madame Darfour know who you were? Yes, Marianne lowered. Her gaze she knew from the beginning. She was the one who sought me out. Her and her fault. Poirot wasn't surprised. He just asked, "Why didn't you ever say so?" "Because it wasn't convenient. Because I was the trace that shouldn't appear." She had erased all the others, but she didn't know how to erase the music. In the library, Judith flipped through the letter for the umpteenth time, as if afraid a word would disappear if she blinked. Too long. Madame Rougier was at her side, visibly more nervous than before. The discovery of the score had unearthed something that even she, with her iron will, couldn't control. "You didn't know," Judith said suddenly. "Did you, Aunt? I didn't know that Marianne—" "No," Rougier replied, his voice barely audible. "I knew Clarisse was hiding something, but I didn't imagine this." Judith dropped the letter on the table. All this time, believing she was just Mum's protege, and in reality, Rougier raised an eyebrow. "So what, really?" Judith turned to her. "Actually, maybe she was. More of a daughter than I was." Rougier paled. "Don't say that." "Why not? It's the truth, isn't it? Who composes a piano piece for someone who means nothing?" Rougier stood up abruptly, unable to respond. There was a poisonous truth hanging in the air, and Judith had just named it. Upstairs, Poirot now examined Clarisse's desk more closely. Something didn't quite fit. It wasn't just the letter or the score. It was an absence, a gap, as if something had been carefully removed from its usual place. In the third drawer, he found an empty envelope with traces of red wax and a faint scent of musk, a fragrance that didn't belong to Clarisse, but that Poirot had smelled before on Marianne's scarf. That night he found her walking alone in the garden after the storm. With methodical precision, Poirot mentally reconstructed the scene, the unmailed letter, the hidden score, the empty envelope, and a lingering scent. He turned to the mirror on his desk. The surface was clean, but not immaculate. A small, barely perceptible symbol seemed to have been traced with a fingertip on the fogged-up glass, an inverted treble clef, an instinctive gesture of someone looking at their reflection and wishing to remember who they are. Marianne didn't kill out of hatred, Poirot murmured, if she did kill at all. That evening, Poirot summoned everyone to the drawing room. Not yet to reveal the details, but to observe. He seated them as if in rehearsal. Judith on the left, Marianne on the right, Rougier by the grandfather clock. Inspector Beaufoy, always suspicious, stood in the opposite corner. Poirot spoke calmly. "I thank you for your patience. Sometimes the answers don't come all at once, but rather as scattered notes. My job is to compose them." Judith looked at him with tired eyes. "Have you composed anything, monsieur?" "Yes," he said. "A broken melody." He approached the piano. He opened the lid, played 3 notes. Then he stopped. "Do you recognize this sequence?" Marianne swallowed. "Yes." Poirot stared at her. "What does it mean?" "It was a code," she finally said, "between Mum and me. When I played that, it meant, don't talk." Judith sat up. Why wasn't he talking? "Because there were things that weren't meant to be known," Marianne replied. "Things that only music understood." Poirot nodded. And yet, someone spoke, not with words, with actions. Silence. The murderer didn't want revenge, he added. He wanted silence, a definitive silence. But he forgot something, the echo. And Mies Amos, the echo has begun to sing. When the room was empty, Poirot remained alone in front of the open piano. He played the sequence once more, the clef that meant shut up, and yet everything in that house was about to talk. Chapter 15. The painting that listened without seeing. The rain returned during the early hours, as if the sky had regretted having remained silent for so long. Each drop hit the panes of the west wing with an irregular cadence, like the nervous drumming of fingers on a table. In the main drawing room, Poirot stood in front of the large portrait of Clarice de Forest. The painting was old, with firm strokes, and a muted palette that hinted at more than it revealed. Clarice posed in profile, her gaze lost in some invisible spot beyond the frame, a portrait painted so that she doesn't look back. Poirot murmured, as if speaking to himself, very typical of someone who doesn't wish to be confronted. Inspector. Beaufoy then entered, wiping his soaked hat. Are you not sleeping, Monsieur Poirot? I don't sleep when the silence of the living begins to resemble that of the dead. Beaufoy approached, crossing his arms. Do you have the culprit yet? Poirot turned slowly. I have something better, a question that only the murderer can answer without trembling. The inspector frowned. And what is that question? Poirot smiled. What portrait ever hung here before this one? Beaufoy blinked. Before, isn't it the original? No. Look carefully, my friend. The painting has been hung recently. The dust on the frame, the recent cleaning of the wall, even the faint mark of another moulding on the plaster. Beaufoy leaned closer to look. Sure enough, a smaller rectangular shadow was barely visible in the dim light. So, someone changed. The painting, yes, and he didn't do it for aesthetic reasons. He did it out of shame or fear. Meanwhile, Marianne walked alone down the second-floor hallway. Her footsteps were almost imperceptible, as if she were afraid of disturbing the floorboards. She entered Clarice's room without turning on the light. She stood for a moment, contemplating the untouched bed, the dried flowers in the vase, and the forgotten perfume on the dresser. He took a small golden key from his pocket. He inserted it into the bottom drawer of his desk and opened it slowly. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with red thread. He didn't touch them. He just looked at them, like someone rediscovering a severed part of themselves. Late, as always, he whispered. Behind her, an unexpected voice broke the darkness. Is that what you were looking for? Judith Marianne jumped, but didn't take a step back. She just turned around, still holding the key. What are you doing here? Same as you, I suppose, Judith said, coming in, looking for what was left out of the official story. Marianne narrowed her eyes. You shouldn't be here. Neither do you. The silence that fell then was thick, like fog on a poorly sealed window. The two women studied each other with an ancient suspicion, as if their lives had been unwittingly intertwined. You knew she was Clarice's daughter, Judith said finally. I didn't know until recently, Marianne replied. And why didn't you say anything? And you? Marianne retorted. Why didn't you ask? Maybe you didn't want to know. Judith frowned. And who killed Mum? Marianne took a deep breath. It wasn't me. But you hated her. No. His voice was firm. I just hated the void he left for me. In the study, Poirot leafed through the music book with white gloves. Each page had meticulous annotations. Not just musical notes, but code words, symbols that seemed personal. A spiral in the right margin, always drawn when certain minor notes appeared, and a single word written in black ink beneath the last piece. Forgive. Poirot carefully closed the notebook. Then he turned to Beaufoy. We have to find the previous painting. What if it was destroyed? Poirot shook his head. A murderer eliminates what he fears, but an emotional culprit just hides it. Where would you look for a forgotten portrait, Poirot? looked at the ceiling. Somewhere where no one looks up. The attic. Access to the attic was via a narrow folding ladder in the back gallery. Dust, cobwebs, and a musty smell greeted them. With the inspector's flashlight, they scanned the walls, until Poirot stopped in front of a rolled-up blanket tied with string. As he unwrapped it, a framed portrait emerged from the dust. The face was recognizable. Marianne, but younger, too young. Beaufoy opened his eyes. "My God, painted in secret," Poirot murmured, hidden out of shame. This was Clarissa's silent confession, her acceptance. But apparently, someone decided the portrait spoke too much. "Do you think this was the cause?" Poirot nodded. "Death, Inspector, rarely happens for a single reason, but repressed emotions, they're silent dynamite." Back in the drawing room, Poirot placed the painting on an upholstered chair. Then he called Judith, Marianne, and Madame Rougier. When they entered, the painting was covered. "Before we go any further, madame," said Poirot solemnly, "I need you to see something." He removed the cloth with a slight gesture. The three women looked at him. Rougier stepped back, his lips parted. Judith took longer to react. It was as if something inside her cracked, not with fury, but with childish sorrow. She brought a hand to her mouth. Mum had ... kept it. Marianne didn't say anything. She just nodded. There were no tears in her eyes. Only acceptance. "This changes everything." Judith said, "I didn't know I had painted it. I didn't know I loved her." Poirot crossed his arms. "Love that isn't shown ... also leaves wounds, sometimes the deepest ones." Rougier sank into an armchair, as if the weight of her years had suddenly fallen upon her. Poirot went to the window and looked out at the rain. Then he murmured, "The truth is coming, mes amis, and like all truths, it won't ask permission to enter." Chapter 16. The time that played backwards. The entire house seemed to have heard the name hidden in the painting. From the moment Marianne's young face emerged from beneath the grey cloth, an ancient silence descended through the corridors, one that seemed to predate even the music. As if time itself held its breath, Poirot, still standing by the window, didn't move. His eyes followed the slow path of a raindrop sliding down the glass, as if the truth could be read in it. Judith had remained motionless in front of the painting. Her half-open lips didn't utter a word, but her labored breathing betrayed a profound shock. It wasn't just the discovery of the portrait, it was the certainty of what could have been said but never was. The wound wasn't bleeding, but it burned. "When did he paint it?" Judith whispered, her gaze never leaving Marianne's young face. "Before or after he found out?" Madame Rougier, in her armchair, was rubbing her hands nervously. Poirot turned to her. "Madame, did you know this portrait existed?" The old woman closed her eyes. A slight tremor ran through her eyelids. "Not for sure," she said, "but ... I suspected it." Clarisse spent hours locked in her study. When I asked, she said she was composing, but the music had stopped flowing to her months ago. There was something else ... a whisper inside her guilt. Poirot nodded gravely. "And why hide it?" "Because painting it was like confessing," Rougier said, "and confessing meant accepting that I'd lied all my life." Judith turned suddenly. "Lied to whom?" "To me." Rougier held her gaze to herself. Later, that night, Poirot retired to his room without saying goodbye. He lit the oil lamp and placed a blank sheet of paper on the desk, not for writing deductions, but for drawing. A spiral, the same spiral that appeared in Clarisse's sheet music notebook. The same one I had found engraved with barely visible pressure on one of the hidden cards. The same one Marianne had absent-mindedly traced with her finger on the breakfast table that morning without knowing she was doing so. Poirot interlaced his fingers. "A symbol isn't proof," he murmured, "but a thread is. And threads, when pulled precisely, reveal where the knot lies." He stood up abruptly. There was one question he hadn't yet asked, not because it had slipped out of his mind, but because the truth wasn't yet ready to be spoken. The next morning, Judith found Poirot in the greenhouse, looking at the withered lilies. "Don't you think we've had enough of these enigmas, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice barely concealing the weariness in her voice. "If you know something, if you've come to some conclusion, don't you think it's time to share it?" Poirot turned gently. "A conclusion is useless without context, mademoiselle. Sometimes the soul needs to be emptied first in order to understand." Judith sighed. Her face was haggard, but her gaze was firmer than in previous days. "I've read the letters," he said at last. Poirot wasn't surprised. He just nodded. "And some are from my mother to Marianne, others to someone else. They never mention full names. They talk about the night on the beach, the broken promise, the echo that never stops. Did you recognize the handwriting? It was hers, although more shaky, as if writing those words cost her blood. And between the lines, was there a confession?" Judith hesitated. "No, but yes, a search, as if trying to write the music that was never finished." Poirot smiled. "Very well said. There are confessions that aren't written down, but rather refined." That afternoon, Marianne asked to speak to him. She found him standing by the piano in the empty living room, with a half-finished cup of tea. "I know you suspect me," he said bluntly. Poirot invited her to sit down. "Suspicion, mademoiselle, is my vocation. Doubt, on the other hand, is a human act. I doubt you as I doubt everyone else. And yet, there is something you can give me that no one else possesses." "What thing?" Poirot leaned forward. "The sound of the last melody." Marianne blinked, puzzled. "The last melody, the one your mother was composing the night she died. I know you found it on the music stand. I know you memorized it." Marianne looked down. She placed a hand on her chest, as if the music was still trapped there. "It wasn't a complete melody," he said. "It was almost an echo." A phrase he repeated with slight variations, as if he were doubting the ending. Poirot nodded. "Would you play it for me?" Marianne hesitated. Then she walked over to the piano. She sat down. She took a deep breath. Her fingers trembled slightly, but the first note rang out clearly. A sequence of minor, melancholic chords, an ascending interval, abruptly interrupted. Then the repetition, almost identical, except for a flat that introduced an emotional rift, as if the melody, no matter how hard she tried, could never be finalized. Poirot closed his eyes and listened. When Marianne finished, he didn't applaud. He just murmured, "Thank you. Now everything fits together." That evening, Poirot asked everyone present to meet in the library. Judith, Marianne, Madame Rougier, and Inspector Beaufoy arrived promptly. The tension was palpable. Poirot stood up slowly, holding a folder. His voice was clear, though low. "We've lived these days surrounded by unfinished music. Every conversation, every glance, has been like a note suspended in the air. And now the beat closes." Judith leaned forward. "Do you know who killed Yet Poirot looked up, but he didn't reply. Instead, he placed the music book and the folded letter on the table, bearing the same insistently drawn spiral. Then he pointed to the final score. This piece wasn't written to be played. It was written to be found, and its rhythm matches the heartbeat of someone who was still alive when she began writing, but never finished. Beaufoy looked at him tensely. And what does that suggest, monsieur? Poirot raised a finger. That it wasn't a farewell letter. It was an act of resistance. A score written as a cry. Marianne stood up. Are you saying it was murder? Poirot stared at her. Oui, mademoiselle. And this time, it won't be silence that dictates the final beat. Chapter 17. The Unsigned Melody. A murder, Beaufoy repeated, as if the syllables tasted like something from another era. The silence that followed was thick, like a black cloth falling over an abandoned piano. Judith didn't blink. Marianne's gaze was lost in some indeterminate spot on the carpet. Madame Rougier closed her fan with a sharp click, almost in resignation. Poirot didn't move. He had left the score open on the low table, next to Clarice's notebook and a small pocket magnifying glass that no one had noticed until then. Don't rush into things, he said finally, with surgical calm. I said this piece was written as a scream, but a scream, Ms. Amos, isn't always against another. Sometimes it's against oneself. I'm not yet ruling out the possibility of suicide, but I can assure you of one thing. Clarice was afraid. Judith gritted her teeth. Fear of whom? From the one who knew her oldest secret, Poirot replied. The one who knew what Marianne must not know. The one who threatened to make silence speak. Everyone then looked at Marianne. She, however, didn't seem offended. She just said, And what is that secret, Monsieur Poirot? If you know it, tell me at once. Poirot approached the portrait that had been hanging there since the previous day. He touched the edge of the frame with almost reverential slowness. The secret isn't in the blood, he said. It's in the choice. Clarice, in her youth, was loved by two people. One of them left a wound that never healed, and that wound took the form of a girl. Marianne looked down. So I'm not the daughter of whom you thought, Poirot said delicately, but the daughter of a passion so intense that guilt covered her like ashes for years. Judith jumped up. We knew that, or at least we suspected it. But what does that have to do with his death? A lot, said Poirot, because the past doesn't forgive when you try to bury it without confession. And whoever feared that truth would resurface, acted, out of impulse, out of fear, or out of calculation. Marianne watched him with a dense stillness. And do you think that person is still among us? Yes, replied Poirot. And this score is proof. He turned to Beaufoy. Inspector, may I count on your discretion for a few more hours? What do you plan to do? Let the music speak. That evening, Poirot asked Judith and Marianne to accompany him to Clarice's studio. The room was just as they had left it days before. The covered canvases, the sealed jars of pigment with dust around the edges, the empty easel. There's something we don't understand yet, Poirot said, pointing to the corner where the cello had rested. Clarice was methodical, obsessive, even in her disorder, but in this room, there's an absence I can't ignore. Judith looked at him, without understanding. Absence of what? Of noise, said Poirot. Marianne frowned. Noise, yes. The sound of someone not playing. The forced silence of someone afraid of being heard. The studio was her refuge for months, and yet There's no trace of a recent rehearsal, no loose strings, no sheet music out of place. Everything is clean. Judith finally understood. Are you suggesting that someone cleaned up the scene, or that Clarisse did it? Said Poirot. That she knew she was going to die. And she left her stage, like someone leaving a stage after the last performance. But there's a contradiction. He took out a neatly folded linen handkerchief. Inside was a small piece of hardened wax. Found this inside the resonator of the parlor piano. It shouldn't be there. It's finger wax to protect the strings. Clarisse never used it. But Marianne, ... Yes. The young woman stood up in disbelief. What are you implying? Poirot looked at her kindly, without aggression. Nothing. Except that you were the last one to play that piano before your death, and the melody you played. It's not just a reconstruction. It's an exact reproduction. Every measure, every... Pause. Marianne paled. How do you know? Because I heard that melody one night, by accident, as I was walking down the hall. Clarisse was playing it, and you memorized it perfectly. Only. Someone who's heard it many times could do that, Judith whispered. So, she left it for Marianne. Poirot shook his head. No, Marianne picked it up, but the message was for someone else. Someone who would understand the repetition, the apparent error, the broken rhythm. He walked over to the desk and opened the third drawer. He took out another sheet of paper, seemingly blank, and held it under the lamp. The notes were written in very faint pencil, barely visible. An early version of the same piece, said Poirot, but with an additional measure. One that was omitted from the final version. One that contains a signature. Judith approached. Marianne didn't move. Business, Poirot nodded. Not a rubric. A musical signature. 3 specific notes. C, D flat, F, the musical initials of a name. Clarisse used them in her early compositions. It was her way of leaving a mark. And in this latest one, the mark appears again. Beaufoy, who had remained at the door the whole time, finally entered. And what name do these notes form, Monsieur Poirot? Poirot put down the score. I'll reveal that tomorrow, in the library, where it all began. That night, the mansion once again fell into a thick silence. No one was completely asleep. Judith sat by the fireplace, reading her mother's letters once more. Marianne didn't turn on the light in her room. Madame Rouzier prayed longer than usual, and Poirot, he walked through the corridors, as if listening, to the echoes of a melody that only he fully understood. The spiral was about to close, and the last bar, finally, would be played. Chapter 18, the final measure. The library was dimly lit as they entered one by one. Judith was dressed in ash grey, Marianne in pitch black. Madame Rouzier held her rosary like a lifeline. Inspector Beaufoy stood in the corner, arms crossed, his face hardened by the suspicion he already sensed. Poirot waited by the window, his back straight, his hair perfectly combed as on his first day at the Pension. On the central table rested the 3 objects that had guided him from the beginning: the score, the notebook with the spiral drawn in the margin, and the letter that Clarisse never sent. Mesdames, Poirot began, without raising his voice, there is a truth waiting. And, as with all truths, it is not comfortable, but it is necessary. Everyone remained silent. Clarisse Rouzier didn't die of her heart, he continued, or by accident. She was pushed into silence, not with visible violence, but with a threat, an anguish she couldn't handle, and that ended up killing her. Beaufoy stepped forward. Do you have any proof, Poirot? The Belgian nodded. Not the kind you'd bring before a judge, but enough for logic, for understanding, and for the soul. He turned to Marianne - Mademoiselle. You were the unwitting center of this tragedy, but not its cause. Marianne said nothing. Clarisse left clues because she was an artist. She didn't know how to speak with sharp words, but she knew how to shout with notes. The piece you played was her farewell, but also her accusation and her will. Poirot took the score with great care. The 3 final notes, C, D flat, F, they're not just a signature, they're a wound. Because that progression, used in his youth, had a name behind it. Frederick Dauphin, Madame Rouzier, held her breath. Marianne opened her eyes as if awakening from a very long sleep. Judith frowned. Marianne's father. Poirot nodded slowly. Mediocre musician, a volatile man. But Clarisse's first love, and the man who left her when he learned she was pregnant. Years later, he tried to come back. Now married. Now with a name. Now with arrogance. Poirot took an old photograph out of his pocket. It was worn, with torn edges. It showed a young Clarisse, embracing a man with dark eyes and a distant smile. This portrait was hidden in a false bottom of his desk, and behind it was a dedication, for the blessing that never heals, for the wound that never heals. Marianne looked at him, motionless. Why? Did you keep it? Because she never forgave him, but she never forgot him either. Poirot then turned to Judith. His voice was softer now. Mademoiselle, you knew part of this story. Clarisse told it to you in fragments, without names. You pieced it together. With intuition, with jealousy, and with fear. Judith clenched her hands. And that makes me guilty. No, said Poirot. But the temptation to protect his place was strong. Too strong. Poirot held up Clarisse's notebook. This diary wasn't written for Marianne. It was for you. And you left it for her without telling her, because she still believed she could trust her other daughter. Judith paled. I don't. You haven't had. It, Poirot interrupted gently. Not with your hands. But he did say something to her that night. He showed her a letter. He told her how her legacy could change if the truth came out. And that ... was enough. Judith murmured, I just wanted him to wait, to think. Poirot nodded, and she did, but she thought so hard that her heart broke before she decided. A thick silence filled the room. Marianne wept silently. Madame Rouzier whispered prayers. Judith didn't blink. Beaufoy broke the silence. And what do we do now? Poirot took a deep breath. The justice of the soul is not that of the penal code. There is no punishable crime, but there is an inheritance. And that, Mademoiselle Marianne, now belongs to you. Marianne looked up. What inheritance? The choice. What to do with the truth? Whether to turn it into shadow or light? You are no longer just the daughter of an artist. You are the daughter of pain and of possibility. Poirot approached the score. Do you want to know what the spiral means, Marianne? Nodded. Poirot showed the drawing. A spiral that closes is a confession. One that opens is a hope. Clarisse drew it when she felt she could say something without speaking. The last spiral in the notebook is incomplete, because she was still hoping that someone would listen. He turned to everyone, and today, finally, we heard her. Hours later, Inspector Beaufoy left without handcuffs, but with a story to last forever. Judith called a train to Paris. She didn't run away. She simply sought some silence of her own. Madame Rougier retreated to the convent where she had grown up, and Marianne sat down at the piano. The house was empty, but not silent on the music. The score was open, and when his fingers touched the first note, the air changed. The spiral began to open again, and finally the wound began to sing.